Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can do so with a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement makes this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. So Joe Biden has been putting out many reforms. Well, reforms, let's put that in quotes. But he has been talking a lot, either about the PRO Act, either the 1.9 trillion stimulus that was passed, or this new family bill that he is trying to put forward. That is, he's going to address tonight. This is the American Families Plan, which will cost upwards of $2 trillion. The Republicans have been against all of this, be it infrastructure, be it stimulus, or in this case, be it family, despite them not necessarily having the language, at the very least not successfully, to attack it. One of the things that will come up in absolutely is price tag. They would say we're $20-something trillion in debt. Biden is trying to bankrupt the United States. Do they have a point? Will it bankrupt the United States? Are these plans necessary? And more importantly, the person that we're going to talk to, Steve Grumbine, will definitely say no to this. He would say that these things will not bankrupt the United States. And I agree with him. But there is a question to be reached of, at what point does it become deleterious? At what point does it create a problem for us, not just in the country itself, but also in the international monetary order? The voice that you guys are about to hear is Steve Grumbine. He's a political, economic, and social justice activist and founder of Real Progressives and Real Progress in Action, a 501c3 and 501c4, respectively dedicated to education and advocacy for modern monetary theory. Steve, welcome to the show, man. Thank you for joining us, especially on short notice. Thank you.
Yeah, not a problem, Jamarl. Always there for you, brother.
Absolutely. So let's get into it. So MMT, man, we've had this conversation before about MMT. You know, all things being equal, I agree with you. I think my thing comes in that money is not real. And MMT on some level hits at that, even though it doesn't necessarily go there. And what I mean by that is your economic system runs in line with real material concerns. So I think the example that we gave had to do with education, or let's say if Biden comes out and says everybody can go to school for free. Great. Well, does that mean that there's going to be new textbooks? Does that mean new desks, new chairs? And what does it mean when all of these people are trying to pull from these resources all at once? Well, there's not going to be enough. You're going to have a situation where there's going to be a certain degree of inflation to compensate for the lack of real supplies. It's basically dollars chasing items. And that's when we get into inflation. And correct me if I'm wrong, MMT's argument is basically, look, as long as the real material supplies are there, and as long as this money is denominated in the currency of that country and their sovereign currency, they can spend whatever they need to spend to accommodate whatever they need to accommodate. Before I go further, I just want to make sure that that's right, that there's no, that I'm framing this correctly.
Well, I mean, it's as correct as we're going to get right now. I mean, you can slice that thing with Occam's razor all the way down to a nub. Bottom line is that I think the one thing that you say that I think that is kind of like a Jamarl stronghold is that money's not real. And I would say, well, it depends on what your definition of real is, right? So yes. You're looking at it like in terms of a commodity money. No, it's no more real than Bitcoin or any of those other things. But what it is something different. So it's not what you think it is. It's a tax credit, and this is very real. And it's the obligation of that tax credit that is extremely real, both to the government in terms of accepting it as payment for taxes, and also for you. But if you don't pay your taxes, right? So it's very, very real. If you're thinking about it in terms of, I can use this thing and get a weight of $1 and get that much gold, then no, it's not real in that sense. But that's not what it's claiming to be. It's claiming to be a tax credit. And so
I was thinking of it just as a concept. Like, I guess I'm thinking,
but it's
whether
very
it's gold,
that's
whether
what I'm
it's
saying. So structure, there's a very good article by a gentleman named Brett Scott And he talks about the form and structure of money and payment systems and all that is tied together, and that the dollar is not separate from the payment system, and all these different aspects of what actually is money and what actually is currency and what actually is the government unit of account and so forth. So I think it's important.
I'll be honest, Steve. Thank you for joining us, but I feel like we've had this exact conversation. Like,
yes, we have
almost every time you've joined us. We've had this. Like,
I want you guys to grab this whole. I want you to hold on to this, because this if we get past this point right here, we have a whole new set of conversations we can have.
The conversation I want to have gets into the notion of external implications. Like, say you're right, and say that for the most part, the government can spend whatever it needs to spend. And let's say they get to $50 trillion, or let's say that number goes higher. Yes. What does the external economic system regard the U.S. as? Meaning, there are consequences for that from externally, even if internal from the standpoint of the country itself, and we can denominate those things in our own currency. Aren't there external consequences from other countries? Let's say like the UK, or let's say like, I don't know, China, or France, some of these other economic centers that take great issue with the United States increasing its deficit to that degree.
You know what? Not really, because what we do internally in our own country, we have the ability to move, shake, and change whatever we need to, just like they do, by the way. You know, this is not a one-way street here. And China very much manipulates its currency. So does Japan. So does Australia. So this is not some weird, funky conspiracy thing. This is what all governments that want to maintain a reasonably healthy whole society, although we've kind of slipped the plot on that one. But
here's the thing, Steve. I think everybody here, it's not like, again, I do not know of any government that currently runs in a gold-backed dollar or a gold-backed currency in general. I don't think we're making a cartoonish claim that any manipulation of a currency is going to lead to runaway inflation and the collapse of the economy or anything like that. But I think what Jamarl said was, if we keep doing it, or if we do it too much, or something to that effect. In other words, it's kind of simple. If you have more dollar-denominated debt around the globe, and you have, frankly, just more dollars floating around, as you have an increase in the supply of something, the value per unit tends to go down if demand remains equal. That seems like one of the most basic tenets of economics.
Commodity-based thinking.
Simply.
That's not the same, though. It really is not.
But isn't the dollar a kind of commodity in the way that it's used internationally, and the fact that it is a reserve currency? And simply, if you have currency exchange, if all of a sudden there were 10 times as many British pounds as there are used to today, are you saying that the value of the pound wouldn't drop? Because it doesn't.
As long as it's $1 for one tax credit, no joke. That literally is that simple. I swear, I promise you, it's that simple. And the flip side to this is
I don't trust a promise, Steve. I do not trust a promise from an economist. I'm sorry. I've learned this one the hard way.
Well,
give me more specifics.
I'm not an economist. I just slept at a Holiday Inn Express. Yes, that's my claim to this, right? I had a good night's sleep at a Holiday Inn Express. But what I'm trying to tell you is this. You're thinking of, we just spend. There's only one action. This one action is a direct action. It is spending money. And I'm saying that it does not happen in a vacuum like that. There is taxation that is occurring. There are fines, fees, and penalties that are pulling money out. There are savers that are saving money and pulling money out of the economy. There are sorts of demand leakages all over the economy. So when you're talking about spending money, you're talking about it as a singular activity in absence of any of the other offsets and things throughout the economy. That's the first thing. So I reject that framing. From my perspective, I reject that framing. The second thing is that when you're dealing within the United States, within the domestic U.S. economy, where the dollar is the currency that we use to transact, in that space, the dollar does whatever the dollar needs to do. In fact, China will leave its money at the Fed, wrapped up in savings, if you will, to use to facilitate trade within the United States. If it decides that it no longer wishes to hold dollar assets, then it will get rid of those dollar assets and buy assets somewhere else. It'll save in a different currency. So really the question is, where do they want to save their money? Where do they do the most business? Where do they feel like saving their currency? And so if you think about it a little differently, because it's not like they're taking the US dollars back to China and hanging out and holding them and putting them in a wallet somewhere. They're keeping them in the domestic economy to facilitate trade. And so if you go around, this is the way it is everywhere. And then the inter-exchange, the foreign exchange, the back and forth between countries in the basket out there in the international markets, you're looking at a speculator's. What if we made it illegal to speculate on currency? That would piss off an awful lot of investor grade people. But it really doesn't much matter because it doesn't have an impact on what we can and cannot buy in the United States.
All right, Steve, we've got to go to a break. I'm going to bring you back. I want to keep going with this conversation. Fun talking with you as always, and we're going to continue it on the other side. We are joined by Steve Grumbine. He's a political, economic, and social justice activist, also the founder of Real Progressives and Real Progress in Action. Those are a 501c3 and 501c4, respectively, each dedicated to education and advocacy for modern monetary theory, about which we're talking right now. You can follow Steve on Twitter at SDGrumbine and at Real Progress US. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back with Steve on the other side of this short break.
Fault Lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Stuck in traffic? No problem. Stay informed. Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik on 105.5 FM or 1390 AM in the Washington, D.C. area. Need more? Follow us on Facebook or check us out on SputnikNews.com.
Fault Lines.
And we are back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we are joined by Steve Grumbine, political, economic, and social justice activist and founder of Real Progressives and Real Progress in Action. We're talking modern monetary theory, the potential for inflation, exchange rates, whether you can, I'm going to overly simplify it, but whether you can have as many dollars as you want and how that will affect the value of the dollar per se. Steve, I have 2 points here, both from an extremely broad perspective. You're probably familiar with the guy, Nassim Nicholas Taleb, the sort of social commentarist and theorist, and I believe originally a statistician who came up with this idea that probably his best known book about black swans, the idea that you'll have these extremely rare events that nobody foresees or that few people foresee. But when they happen, you should be prepared for them. Also has that book, Anti-Fragile. I'm familiar with the dude's work, and his work comes to mind at this point because what you're talking about in some sense is a relative, it's not a completely closed system. The United States dollar is not a closed system by any means. You know, other countries buy it, other countries sell it, and it ties into the world economy. But from within the modern monetary theorist perspective, it seems like they treat the US dollar as if it were a more or less closed system. And for the course of that system's history, it's more or less stable. You can, the value fluctuates, it goes up and down, but it's only created once, and the assumption is it will only be destroyed once. In other words, it's a sort of continuous entity. And what I'm worried about is that despite the stability of that system, lurking in the theories that you're describing is an unstable core, where if you make the wrong decisions time after time after time, the value, the existence of the dollar will fade away. And it might do so very quickly and unexpectedly. And when you're describing, you sort of did this thing. I'm not trying to mischaracterize that, and I'll pass it back over to you in a second to clarify. But you said if you take everything else into account, if it were just to be what I was saying, where the U.S. government, the Federal Reserve, prints more money, it creates more money. If that were to just happen, well, maybe you'd have an inflation, those things would happen. But if you take all of the other factors in this distributed system of causes and effects and forces, if you take all those other things into account, no, that won't happen because other bits will sort of pick up the slack, and there will be this, systemically distributed process that equalizes it and sort of neutralizes those changes. I don't want to mischaracterize, but the part of that thinking that worries me is that in that complexity, I'm worried that there is something that we're not anticipating, that few people in the public are aware of, that most people in the government aren't aware of, that there are these lurking sort of black holes that you can fall into that will cause that currency to dramatically go down in value or be destroyed. In other words, the complexity, the sort of complex system of processes it might help to save the currency in the short run, but I'm worried that lurking in that complexity is something that's going to destroy them. Does that complaint make sense to you, and what's your pushback on it, Steve?
So thank you. So my pushback is top to bottom on that one. So first things first, you're thinking of the dollar as a commodity. And when you think about it as a commodity, you're thinking about it like whether people accept it or reject it. And I'm telling you, the primary thing there that has to be understood at all times, it's not like something equivocal. This is like a constant, is that as long as the federal government can levy a tax payable in that currency, it doesn't matter whether you like the dollar or not, whether you blow your nose with the dollar or not, it's going to be worth a tax credit. And as long as the federal government can impose a tax payable only in that currency, it will maintain its buying power within the United States. This is what happened with the Confederacy. These knuckleheads, these states' rights people wanted to make sure that they couldn't tax. So the Confederacy, in all its wisdom, couldn't levy a tax, couldn't hold a tax.
And I hear you. Real quick. Here's one big thing. You said within the United States, but what about purchasing goods from other countries? The United States is a net importer.
So what happens if you tell me that you want me to buy something in Japan? We do business. Our industries do business in Japan, and they buy and sell in yuan. Okay. They don't buy and sell in dollars. They buy and sell in yuan when they're doing business in Japan. If Japan wants to do business in the United States,
the dollars are being transferred into their currency in order to do that.
That's correct.
And that, am I wrong? Like for example, if I'm buying something, let's say I have a company, and I'm based in the United States. You're right. I can buy whatever I want. A dollar equals a dollar. But what about in Japan, where I'm like, all right, my company, who's based in the U.S., who has a ton of dollars, now wants to transfer those dollars to buy some product that's in Japan. Well, at that point, we're reaching outside of the country. And at that point, it does become a commodity on some level, right? I mean, it's a comparison, a relative comparison.
What happens if it's no longer cost effective to buy imports? Now, what do you do? Tell me what you do if it's no longer cost effective to buy imports.
Well, ideally, we'll make it internally. That's assuming that you have access to the product.
I got a great, easy answer for this. You start building domestically. Okay.
That's what happens. But like Keynes said, in the long run, everybody's dead. In the long run, we all might survive. You might get there, but you're going to deal with some serious economic tribulations along the way. And that doesn't, hyperinflation doesn't suddenly mean that there's an apocalypse at home. It doesn't mean that literally everybody drops dead. But a lot of people do die. A lot of people's quality of life is lowered, and sometimes it leads to permanent destabilization, permanent dismantling of that country's position internationally. It leads to would lead to serious disruptions for a lot of people living in the United States. I agree with you. In the long run, you go towards something like autarky, where you produce a lot more of your goods at home because you can't buy them from other countries because it's not cost effective to do so. But that's a serious hurdle.
Well, let me ask you a question. You hear a bunch of people saying that the United States is the richest country in the world.
Well, in that moment, this dollar is a commodity also, right, Steve?
No, it's not. That's what I'm trying to tell you.
Even in that moment, it's still not. Like, I understand your argument when it's at home. A dollar is a tax credit, just 1-to-1. It's like, whatever. If there were no other country on this planet, dollars rule. But the moment that you're talking about, let's say, like yen, or you're talking about the Egyptian pound or something like that, well, there is a comparison between those two things. Those two things do become this kind of juxtaposition of value with one another, where one has a relative value against the other. That doesn't make it true once it leaves the country.
Let me ask you a question. If I want to do business with the United States, if I want 350 million people, access to 350 million people, what do? Do I just sit there and say, well, I don't have confidence in the dollar, so I'm not going to do business in the United States anymore? No, it's not going to happen. First of all, you see them fighting these wars. What you're seeing, let me tell you one thing that you are seeing. What you are seeing is countries like China working to pull themselves out of the dollar payment system so that the United States cannot manipulate them with sanctions and other things. So what you are seeing is a power play, has nothing to do with whether or not they'll do business with the United States. They depend heavily on doing business with the United States. That's got nothing to do with the dollar, though. What they're saying is
the whole currency manipulation thing, I'll hand it back to you, but just to add in a sort of side note here, attempted, addition, the whole currency manipulation claim that the United States makes against China is that they're artificially weakening their currency to effectively incentivize domestic manufacture for export to countries like the United States. That's effectively the claim that we make against them. And in a way, the exact same claim can be made against us by artificially increasing the value of the American dollar through the whole reserve currency thing and the Triffin dilemma. That fits into that process. But just to add into that, the nature of how they treat their currency is basically incentivizing exports, right?
Yeah, look, if you want to maintain that we are a net importer, if your desire is for us to purchase goods and services around the planet, giving them pieces of paper for their real resources, if that's what your position is, then dollar hegemony is very, very good for you. If that's not your position, if you're looking for a more egalitarian position, and they start saying, hey, we're going to go ahead and apply tariffs and levies against the U.S. dollar. We're not going to sell to you. We refuse to do business with you. We won't accept your money or something like that. Well, you've made a position there, and the United States is going to do what it's always done, just like what Japan would do or Australia would do. They're going to buy it from a different supplier. And so this is a constant. So the question always becomes, do you want to process and maintain your own goods and services in theater, in your country, or do you want to distribute your supply chain around the world? If you distribute your supply chain around the world, it's very, very similar to what the military-industrial complex did in the United States, where they went ahead and took the bolts and put them in Seattle, the seats down in Mexico, the frigging windshields up in Maine, and they said, yeah, please go ahead and cut the military. Why don't you? And watch every state in the nation go to hell and back. And so this is what we've kind of done around the world.
There are a few things that you say. There are a few things that you say that often we disagree, but I'm in 100% agreement with you on that. And I'm kind of quoting you the last time you came on the show. You're saying something about what I said. We're talking about Wall Street, but agreed completely. I guess we only have a couple minutes left here. I think that often when people talk about modern monetary theory, a lot of the advocates of it speak of it as if it is a panacea, as if it is a sort of financial mode of operations, a financial MO, in which as you operate in that mode, you can solve all of these problems across the board. But like any other way of operating, it might be more up to date, and it might be more in line with how our currency is currently run. But as you operate it, you have to make hard choices. And like you're saying, if the value of the dollar drops dramatically and we're unable to buy enough imports from other countries to satisfy the needs of Americans, and therefore we have to incentivize domestic manufacturing, I think that kind of thing would be good, but that's not without some serious economic tumult. And that's, I guess, just what I want to stress, is that as a way of doing business, go for it. Go
back, 1946, Beardsley Rummel, Fed chair at the New York Fed, sat there and said, we are removed from the threats of the market. We are no longer slaves to the market. We no longer have to worry about the ebbs and flows of the business cycle because we recognize the power of the government to create and spend money and do whatever we must do. And tax policy is always based on it should be, let's put this, good tax policy should always be based on whether we want strong buying power of the dollar or a weak buying power of the dollar. And sometimes we may want a weaker position. Inflation is not always bad. It depends on what position you're in. If you're the debt holder, inflation stinks. But if you're the debtor and inflation happens, you're a pretty happy person because now all of a sudden you can actually escape your debts. So there is a good case for inflation at times, although we're in no way, shape, or form in any way close to anything like that. And there's a very big difference, a huge chasm of difference between hyperinflation, which is outright currency rejection, which comes from severe supply shocks like those moments, those black hole moments, those black swan moments, or what we would call a Minsky moment. Hyman Minsky was famous for this, talking about fragility and all this other stuff. This is a very, very serious thing to consider, but it has nothing to do with what you're saying. Like us spending money, it doesn't really have, that's not what this is about. What this is about is supply chains and real resources, and whether or not we have the human capital to do labor, and whether we have the raw materials to build and manufacture the things we need to survive. And, a lot of the places that we see that have had these horrible hyperinflations usually lose food sovereignty or didn't have full sovereignty. They didn't have the ability to grow crops. They didn't have the ability to build the things they needed to build internally, infrastructure-wise. They were highly dependent on everybody else. The U.S. is none of the above.
No, we heavily subsidize agriculture. We're intensely involved in that stuff. And I'm not saying that we're about to be Weimar Germany or Zimbabwe. I'm not saying that we're at the precipice of that stuff. I think that a lot of people are worried about that. And in my opinion, a lot of those fears are unfounded. And you can partly tell that because they keep bringing them up. It's decades at this point that different people have said we're right on the precipice of a financial cataclysm. So to be clear, I'm not saying that's about to happen. But here's the thing. We've got to close this. We've got to close this segment down. If you had to explain briefly, and we just touched upon some elements of it, but if you had to address people who are worried about hyperinflation, imminent hyperinflation in the United States, what keeps us from getting to that point? If you had to look at the United States and try to define it in sort of simple layperson's terms, why are we not at that brink? What keeps us from there? Steve.
First things first, no matter what happens around the world, if we ever had to eliminate all trade outside the United States, we literally can produce what we need in the United States. When we say we're the richest country in the world, it's not because we have the most pieces of paper. It's because we have vast, rich resources at our disposal. So when you think about it like that, I'm not so sure we are the richest country in the world, because I think probably a lot of land mass in Russia and China would allow them to have an incredible amount of resources that they probably never tapped. So the question becomes whether or not we're nowhere near. We're not even in danger of hyperinflation. Hyperinflation is not even a thing at all. Probably the biggest fear that anybody could have, which would sound like the ownership class fearing, would be that there might be some minor inflation that would help us debtors out, us people with student debt, us people with housing debt, us people, wages have not gone up in 50 years. So to think of this as somehow or another we're going to have huge inflation when you can't have inflation with a stock, meaning cash. You can have inflation, however, with flows. And as long as your flows are stagnant the way they are today, in other words, regular people don't have buying power, you're in you'd have to make a really strong case to me why we're going to be in some crazy inflationary spiral when the regular person doesn't have enough money to make it till next week. We're facing mortgage prices.
Velocity of money.
Yes. Yeah, velocity of money. Real quick, before we leave, if you had to make one change, and maybe one change is not enough, just if you had to make a structural change in order to, because this was a conversation we were having prior about the need for structural changes in order to make kind of adjustments in the system that go beyond the cosmetic. Okay, we're going to give an extra $1 for this. Okay, well, that's nice. That's not really changing it. What would you point to? Like, what would be the thing that you would focus on if you said, all right, this is the change that we need to do that will structurally give us to a better position in this country from the standpoint of people, workers, et cetera, et cetera? What were your thoughts?
I mean, there's so many things, but like one of the most important things I would do is eliminate rent-seeking behaviors, get rid of bonds in the way that we do them today, get rid of the finance sector, literally wipe it out. I mean, I personally think finance is the most predatory thing out there. There's a way for people to save. There's a way to do it properly. The way we're doing it now is like we're living in a Bitcoin world. And I don't just mean within Bitcoin. I'm talking about within the stock market, within your 401ks, within pension plans. I mean, you literally are taking your life into your hands. If you look at what's happening right now with JP Morgan and Chase and all the rest of it, what you've got is they have literally built in so much corruption through the entire system to funnel that money away and to literally steal from your assets, that if we don't take direct action on that predatory finance capital, we will have major problems. That right there is a major game changer, because corruption can bring about hyperinflation type deals. So if you want to know what I would
Steve,
focus on,
again,
that is it.
100% agree. We talk about rent seeking on this show. That's a term I've used multiple times. And yes, agree. The finance industry, Wall Street, a lot of those problems, stuff we agree on. And I'll admit, I'm not qualified enough to say I fully agree with it. So I'm being a little bit overconfident here. I get the sense that something is rotten in Denmark when it comes to what's happening on that high level. But we want to get more into it. It'd be great to, we've talked about bringing Bill Black on the show. We talked about having multiple people on to get in some of the more intricate aspects of this. We need to close the segment out, though. Steve Grumbine, thank you for joining us.
Man, thanks so much.
Hey, for those listening, thank you. That was Steve Grumbine, political, economic, and social justice activist and founder of Real Progressives and Real Progress in Action, dedicated to education and advocacy for modern monetary theory. You can follow Steve on Twitter at SDGrumbine and at Real Progress US. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We have callers, and we're taking more in our rap segment, the last segment of today's show. 202-521-1320 is the number. Get in touch. We'll be back taking your calls in just a minute.
Fault Lines.